At this point, somebody has to go down for this. And I don't care who it is.
My name is Norman Simmonds, and I'm serving a life sentence for a crime I didn't commit. I'm going to take you through how the prosecutor lied, hid evidence that pointed to someone else committing the crime, and created a theory that the facts contradicted. Everything that I tell you or show you comes from court records and official documents. At the end of this, all I want you to do is ask yourself, was justice done?
This is one of those cases where somebody has to go to jail. And unfortunately, you're the easiest somebody.
On August 31st, 2019, a shooting took place at the Polo Club Apartments off Handbrick Road in Stone Mountain, just after midnight. A young man lost his life, and what should have been a thorough investigation quickly turned into a rush to find somebody to blame. At the beginning of the investigation, I wasn't even a suspect. When police first started investigating the murder, they were focused on a couple of other people. But when a couple of those suspects disappeared, the focus shifted to me. Instead of following the evidence wherever it led, police came up with their own theory. The problem was, it didn't seem to care if the facts contradicted it. Their theory was, this all started because of an insurance fraud scheme. After months with no progress, the detectives claimed they received information pointing them towards a new motive. They claimed that me and the victim were involved in an insurance fraud scheme. And after a disagreement over money, I decided to kill him. This is a lie. But from that point, that became the basis for the entire case against me. But here's the thing. Once you start looking at the evidence, the whole theory starts to fall apart. The person the state claimed introduced me to the victim was somebody they called Jada Barber. But later during my trial, even the prosecutor said that Jada Barber doesn't exist. Then we have the phone records. The state claimed I was talking to the victim, guiding him over the phone before the accident. But when you look at the actual phone records, those calls aren't there. Then we have my injuries. The story claims I was standing outside of the vehicle when the crash took place so that I can fake injuries as part of this insurance fraud scheme. But in reality, I suffered multiple ruptured discs, a fractured kneecap, and a head injury because I was inside of the vehicle, not standing outside of it like their story said. Then there's also the victim's documented mental health history. Medical records show that he had been diagnosed with something they call brief psychotic disorder, along with other mental health issues. And the victim had a history of erratic behavior. But instead of stepping back and asking whether their theory still made sense, they kept moving forward with it. The facts never changed. The evidence never changed. The only thing that changed was the story that the police decided to tell. And it didn't stop there. While they were busy trying to convince the jury that I committed this murder, they made sure the jury never heard any evidence that pointed to someone else committing this crime. So they never got the full picture. And when you don't get the full picture, that makes it a whole lot easier to trick people into thinking that your story is true.
Now, let me show you what happened next. Once the focus shifted to Simmonds, it wasn't about following every lead anymore. From that point on, it became about building a case against him.
One of the biggest things the state focused on during my trial was a phone call. The state claimed that a phone call was made to the victim shortly before his death, and it connected me to the murder. The phone belonged to someone named Anthony Jones. But according to the prosecutor, Anthony Jones wasn't even a real person. The prosecutor claimed that he was a fake identity that I created to hide who I was so I could murder the victim. And, it sounds convincing until you start looking at the facts. The social security number connected to Anthony Jones existed long before the victim and I ever crossed paths. Think about that for a second. If Anthony Jones was a fake identity I created as part of this murder plot, how could his social security number exist before the victim and I ever knew each other? Then there's something else. Anthony Jones is a real person. At the time, I was helping people repair their credit, and Anthony Jones was one of those people. As part of the process, he obtained what is known as a CPN, or credit privacy number. And during the credit building process, he used my address because he was in between, homes, bouncing from hotel to hotel, which was not unusual for people that I was helping. So Anthony Jones wasn't some fake identity that I created to cover up a murder like the prosecutor painted this picture to be. He was a client, and after I finished helping him repair his credit, he was able to walk into a dealership and finance a vehicle. He was able to move into a luxury apartment in Midtown Atlanta. And keep in mind, you have to produce ID to get a vehicle and an apartment. So the police could have easily figured out that I wasn't Anthony Jones, but that went against the narrative, so they ignored that. Somehow the state took that business relationship and turned it into part of its murder theory. Then they pointed to cell tower records. They said that because the phone connected to Anthony Jones was using a cell tower near the crime scene, and he also was in contact with the victim, that somehow proved that I was involved. But here's the thing. A cell tower doesn't tell you who's holding the phone. It doesn't tell you exactly where the person was. And it definitely doesn't prove that someone committed a murder. Now ask yourself this. If these phone calls were such a big deal, why didn't the investigators look into every phone call the victim received that night? Because according to his phone records, he received quite a few calls right before he was murdered. And we asked the detective this during the trial, and his answer was simply, he was only focused on one number. So again, think about that. The victim received other calls, but we don't know who those other calls was, and far the detective was concerned, it didn't even matter. They didn't do anything to eliminate these people from being suspects. They didn't question them in regards to where they was during the time of the murder, what they were contacting him for. And in a situation like this, something like that is important. But at that point, it wasn't about solving a crime or finding a person who committed this murder. It was about making me the person who committed this murder. So everything else became irrelevant. Any evidence that fit that theory, they emphasized it, and any evidence that pointed to someone else was disregarded. And this is what happens when you build a case instead of solving a crime. Now, it doesn't even stop there. It wasn't just that evidence that they relied on. It was the evidence that the jury never got to hear that was even more trouble.
Now let me show you something that, in my opinion, changes this entire case. Up to this point, you've heard about how the state built its case against Simmonds. Now, I want you to see what the jury never got to hear. Because if you're asking 12 people to decide whether another person is going to spend the rest of his life in prison, shouldn't they hear all of the evidence?
According to police documents, before the victim was killed, he had a serious problem with a local drug dealer. According to the documents, a local drug dealer had pulled a gun and threatened to shoot the victim because he was selling weed on the victim's territory and to his clientele. Now, think about that for a second. I thought that was important because he was murdered right across the street from where this incident took place. But the jury never heard about this, and police never explained how they eliminated this person as a suspect. And it get deep because according to his mother, he took this threat so serious that once while she was dropping him off, he saw the drug dealer and he wouldn't get out of his mother's car until the drug dealer left the area. So when I read that, I'm like, if this man is so afraid of this person that he won't even get out of the car with his own mother sitting right there, I think that's something that the investigators should take pretty seriously and look into. And if not, the jury should have heard about it, but they didn't. And that's not all they didn't hear. Another situation took place after the victim gave his girlfriend an STD. I don't know if it was herpes, crabs, HIV, whatever it was serious enough for her family to beat him badly. And according to police documents again, he talked about getting revenge, and this just shows the violent conflicts that he was dealing with, prior to the murder. And again, police didn't care nothing about that, and the jury never got to hear it. So the full picture was never painted for the jury. Now I want to tell y'all about the night of the murder. And this part of the story comes from the victim's friend who was with him for the entire day, all the way up until when he was murdered, according to police. His name was Dwayne Ricks. And according to him and the victim started their day around 12 o'clock noon when a light-skinned female in a red car came to meet the victim and give him $40 for something that Dwayne said he didn't know what it was. He said after that, the victim and this female were talking and texting all day in regards to meeting up again. And this is important because according to Dwayne Ricks, when he was murdered, he was on his way to pick up another $40. But again, the jury never got to hear this. Now, Rick said when he walked with the victim across the street to pick up the $40 from somebody in apartment 1010, he didn't go upstairs to the apartment. He said he waited in front of the building. And after that, he said shortly after the victim got into the breezeway where he couldn't see him anymore, he heard gunshots. So he said he took off running. And I understand running from gunshots, but it get a little strange because after that, he went home and just went to sleep. He didn't call the cops. He didn't call his friend to see if he was all right. He didn't even text his friend to see if he was all right. He ran home, laid in the bed, and went to sleep. And, what does that mean? I don't know. But that's what he says happened. But again, the jury wasn't allowed to hear this. The only reason that Rick spoke to the police was because the victim's mother found out later that he was with her son on the night of the murder, and she directed police to him. And another thing was the victim received multiple calls prior to the shooting from different people, and investigators knew that. And I said before, when we asked the detective why didn't he investigate any of the other numbers that was in contact with the victim leading up to the murder, and he answered he was only focused on one number, the number that he made to be mine. And again, once they decided that I was the suspect, nothing else mattered. And a real investigation doesn't stop once you have a suspect. But that's not what happened in my case. The jury only heard one story about one suspect with a false motive, but they didn't hear everything. And what happened in my case, I never would think would even be possible in a courtroom. asking people to make a decision without all of the information, placing my life in the hands of these 12 people, but not giving them everything they need to make the decision. But that's what happened in my case. There was a false statement, which we went over, where...
Throughout this documentary, you've seen the prosecution's theory, the evidence presented at trial, and the evidence that was never presented to the jury. Now it's time to examine what happened when 12 jurors were asked to decide Norman Simmonds' fate and why the verdict remains the most troubling part of this case. This is the final chapter.
After about a week of testimony, arguments, and evidence, they gave the case to the jury, and put it in the hands of the 12 jurors. After hearing the evidence, initially the jury was split. 6 jurors guilty, 6 jurors not guilty. So half of the jury felt like I should go free. But as deliberations continued, the vote changed. The very next day, the count was 6 guilty, 4 not guilty, 2 undecided. But by the end of the day, all 12 of the jurors came back saying guilty. No new evidence, no new witnesses, nothing changed from yesterday except the vote. So I want you to think about that. What are deliberations after the first vote? After everybody already listened to every witness, they already made their minds up about what they believe happened. I feel like after the first vote, deliberations turn into people trying to convince one another to change their minds. It's not about evidence anymore. It's about who has the most influence. Because 6 people don't go from believing someone should go free to voting guilty without a lot of pressure on their head. Because like I said, the evidence didn't change, but their minds did. Right after that, I was sentenced to spend the rest of my life in prison. Life. And something that still doesn't make sense to me, aside from the lack of evidence, is that the night that this crime took place, I was in a hospital with my pregnant wife. I wanted y'all to hear the evidence before I told you this. But that night, before 12 o'clock, we went to a hospital in Gwinnett County because my wife was experiencing some difficulty with her pregnancy. And we ended up staying in the hospital till 7 o'clock the next morning. And you don't have to believe me, we have the records to verify what I'm telling you. So I'm spending the rest of my life in prison if I don't get this sentence overturned for a crime that happened while I was in a hospital with my pregnant wife. So I showed you how they shifted the evidence and disregarded everything after they focused on me. I showed you how the facts contradict their theory. And I showed you the evidence that the jury didn't hear. And now I want to ask you, do you believe that justice was done? My name is Norman Simmonds, and I definitely appreciate you taking your time to listen to my story. And if you believe my case deserves another look, please share this documentary with anybody willing to take a listen. I appreciate y'all. Be safe.
No eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no DNA, no fingerprints, yet the result was a sentence of life in prison. This is the definition of injustice. If you believe every conviction should be supported by reliable evidence and a fair process, please share this documentary. Help expose what happened in the Norman Simmonds case so more people can examine the facts for themselves and determine whether justice was served.
Every day I wake up behind these walls knowing I didn't commit the crime that put me here. I can't get these years back. I can't get back the time I missed with my kids, the time I missed with my wife, But I do have faith that eventually the truth will come to light. So for now, I'm waiting for justice.